Thank you, everyone, for coming to Queer as a Three-Sided Die. This is a series that Steve and I and some of our friends and colleagues have been doing together for many years now.
Yeah,
going on a decade. We've done it at a variety of conventions. Gen Con is where it started. And each of us have then sort of spider-webbed out to other conventions where we often end up talking about LGBT issues and gaming, whether those issues are the people who play the game, people who appear in the game, and storylines that focus on the experiences of queer people. I'm Jeremy Crawford. I am the lead rules designer of Dungeons & Dragons. I'm also the game's managing editor and the lead designer of the Player's Handbook. And this is...
I'm Steve Kenson. I am a staff designer with Green Ronin Publishing. I'm owner and operator of my own imprint called Ad Infinitum Adventures, where I do Icon superpowered role-playing. And I still somehow manage to find time to freelance for various other game things when I have the opportunity. Right now, I'm lead designer on the new edition of Aberrant for Onyx Path.
Some of you might know that many years ago, Steve and I together designed a role-playing game called Blue Rose, which at the time was very unusual in its featuring of LGBT characters and storylines. Part of the internet poured oil on itself and set itself on fire. It couldn't believe we would have the audacity of telling stories about non-straight people. But we did it. And Blue Rose, just within this past year, had a second edition come out.
Blue Rose has a new edition which is available down at the Green Ronin booth using the Adventure game engine. It's a big, beautiful, full-color hardcover, which is the way it should have been right from the very beginning. And it is nominated for an Origins Award this year. So,
up for Best RPG.
Yeah.
So we chatted beforehand and thought we would each take a turn talking about things we've worked on over the past year or so that have had content in them that would be of particular interest, either to queer people or to allies or creators who are interested in featuring queer content, whether or not you're queer yourself. Also, I always like to say a note about terms. I often use the term queer as an umbrella term for all of us in the LGBTQ family. And so when you hear me saying that, that's what I mean. It's basically a shorthand for me for all of us. And then you can also imagine a plus our friends. So Steve, why don't you go first?
Okay, sure. So I'd say that of my recent and current projects, Blue Rose, the new edition of Blue Rose is certainly one of the most queer inclusive projects, specifically consciously so in terms of world design. And we definitely made efforts in the new edition of the game to be both even more inclusive and to give a lot of additional thought to how that inclusivity manifested. And because oftentimes in world and setting design, especially when you're talking about a fantasy setting, you'll often see inclusion handled as if we delete homophobia, that's inclusion. If we just say, oh yes, well in this fantasy world, queer people aren't hated. Congratulations, you've been included. And that really doesn't do the subject any justice, and in fact isn't actually even inclusion. And so one of the things we looked at was the notion of what is a fantasy culture that truly has a different view of gender and romance like. What does this culture look like? What are people like in it? And one of the things we talk, and I won't go into the full length of how it gets discussed, but it's things like looking at certain assumptions that underlie our own cultures, and that are often so ingrained that we don't question them in terms of what is considered normal or expected or average. So, for example, in the main central culture in Blue Rose, there are specific in-setting expressions for people who are same-sex attracted romantically and opposite-sex attracted romantically. And when I have this conversation, people will often be like, well, what about bisexuals? And I'm like, they don't have they do have a term for that. It's called normal. Because in their culture, everyone is bisexual, except for the weird monosexuals who are only attracted to one gender, whether it's on one end of the spectrum or the other. And everybody in the middle considers that really cute. And of course, in all this, the main culture, because everybody is such a hopeless romantic, there'll always be the occasional, but are you sure? Like, you haven't maybe considered? It would just open up some options. No, I'm good, thanks. Sort of a thing. So that was one particular approach we took, which totally reframed that element of the setting. And all of a sudden, relationships were very different because you couldn't assume that people were attracted to one gender or another.
And honestly, it was a fun way for us years ago when we did this to create a setting where essentially straight people also had to come out.
We're also a minority.
Right. Because again, if the assumption is
that you're bi,
then yeah, if you are attracted to only someone of the opposite sex, well, you've got to come out.
And if you're not, well, So, and there's a great deal more in Blue Rose, and I could go on probably for the most of this about that. Crystal Frazier, who worked on a section of the new edition, did a wonderful bit about the place of trans people in the Alden culture, and how they're very strongly associated with a lot of the particular arcane talents that people in the culture are known for. So trans people have a very strong association with magic, and unsurprisingly with transformation. So they have a special role within the context of the culture as well. And there's a great deal more in terms of how people constellate relationships, what people think of as marriage, what is the role of polyamory, and non-monogamous or non-binary relationships, and on and on. So there's certainly a great deal of that in Blue Rose, and probably the most inclusive thing that I've worked on recently. The stuff I'm working on now is a little bit more in the framework of modern inclusivity in one form or another. I've been working for the past 8 months or so on the Expanse RPG for Green Ronin. And obviously for folks who are familiar with the Expanse, it's a far future science fiction setting that is been written to be quite inclusive. And so there are a number of queer characters in the setting, and we've obviously continued the effort to make sure that inclusivity is reflected in terms of gender, in terms of orientation, in terms of heritage, and the characters' backgrounds, the fact that people, especially the Belters, are from all over different cultures from Earth, that's reflected in the game and its artwork as well. And most recently, I've been working on the new edition of Aberrant for Onyx Path. And for folks who are familiar with the original edition, Aberrant is a super queer game in many regards, and does a lot with the X-Men theme, basically, of the superhuman as outsider. That is obviously something that speaks to a lot of queer readers in a variety of ways. And we've made a conscious effort to continue that theme and to both have a great deal of inclusivity in terms of the characters and the types of people who are presented. Because one of the notions of Aberrant is that basically who gets superpowers is largely random, and you distribute that randomly across the world, and it turns out that therefore most people who have superpowers are not going to be, straight white male and American. And what happens when all of these, marginalized people, around the world suddenly have superpowers? What happens when they decide to use them and do some things? And stuff starts to get interesting. So there's a certain there's a certain influence from Magneto's secret fan club on Aberrant. It would not be inaccurate. So
in the world of D&D, one of the things I had the pleasure of working on this past year was Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes, which came out fairly recently. And in that book, there was a section I wrote on these blessed elves called the Blessed of Corellon. Now, Corellon, for those of you who don't know, is not only the god of the elves, but actually the parent of the elves. In the D&D multiverse, originally, the first elves sprung forth, sort of like Athena sprang forth from Zeus, sort of the original elves sprang forth from Corellon. And Corellon is this amazing cosmic force that could assume any form and is rumored in some parts of the D&D multiverse to be the personification of raw magic itself. And so elves are this being's children. And something I teased in the 5th edition Player's Handbook is that some of the elves have this special blessing where, like their parent, they are able to change their sex. Now, with a little bit of historical thing that I think even some of you who've worked on D&D don't know, is I actually came up with the idea of the Blessed of Corellon in a Queer as a Three-Sided Die panel at Gen Con years ago, where I was talking because we'll get to a Q&A session after the two of us are done talking. And there was a point where someone from the audience asked, what could you see the role being of people who are gender fluid or trans or non-gendered in a fantasy world? And it suddenly dawned on me right on the spot. Well, we've had this story in D&D going all the way back to the late 70s, that the god of the elves is sometimes male, sometimes female, sometimes neither. And that's been a part of D&D's story for many, many decades. But we'd never really done anything with it. So I said, well, I could imagine there would be, in this panel, there would be these elves who manifest that gift. And so when we were working on the 5th edition Player's Handbook, I was like, well, we're going to do it. That thing I just mentioned off the cuff in one of these panels, we're going to make it an official part of D&D's lore. Now, in the Player's Handbook, it was really just sort of a throwaway thing, where it was in a section on considering your character's gender identity and your character's sexual orientation. And we said, and by the way, this is also a significant thing for the children of Corellon. So in Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes, it was finally a chance, because we had a whole chapter just on the elves and their history, where they came from, how they think. I thought, okay, now we can write a bit more about this. So it was really a delight to get to put in there not only a mechanical option for how your elf could be one of these elves, and each day when you wake up just decide, today I'm male, today I'm female, today I'm neither. But also I got to explore a little bit, well, what does this mean for elf culture? Especially, what does this mean if the elf who has this gift is a drow? And I bring up the drow because, as you might know, their culture is extremely gendered. And it is also an evil culture. It is a culture where it is stratified along class lines, along gendered lines. There's slavery. It's terrible. But imagine a person who realizes in their youth that I can change my sex. And suddenly I might be able to assume the sex of power in this society. So what I realized is the drow would be terrified of these elves, particularly because these would be elves manifesting a blessing of Corellon, who is Lolth's enemy, Lolth being the god of the drow. And so it's been fun to then imagine that these special drow, show that Corellon has not fully turned their back on the drow, but also that you could have these drow who could become really amazing peacemakers. Because if they went to the surface world and met wood elves and high elves and others who have been sort of culturally trained to hate their drow cousins, if you have one of these drow manifesting this blessing of their god, they would have to admit, maybe this isn't all as cut and dried as we thought, because this god we worship, this god, whom we are descended from, has given this blessing, this ability to manifest this fluidity to these people we consider to be our enemies. And the elves ultimately, and this is something also I delve into in Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes, they are a people of fluidity, and also they are a people of melancholy, because a big part of their cosmic story is they, in their desire for power and to make an imprint on the multiverse, let go of their fluidity and were trapped into fixed forms. And so we explain this is one of the reasons why there are more types of elves than almost any other species in D&D. Over the course of D&D's history, it seems like, every 5 books there's some new version of elf. And again, part of that is because early on, elves could, sort of like Greek gods, assume all sorts of different forms. But in exchange for power, in exchange for making a permanent physical mark in the world, they descended into flesh, and fixed flesh. And so to an elf, that fluidity is the most blessed thing. It would almost be viewed as kind of, sad. A person who is physically the same all the time, mentally the same all the time. I mean, this also helps explain why sometimes elves are viewed as a little flighty, because it's not so much that they're flighty, it's because they have a culture of let's explore constantly new perspectives, new ways of thinking, new ways of being. So I would say in the last year, that is one of the most queer things that I've worked on. While on the side, also making sure that in the adventure we just announced, Dragon Heist, as usual for all of our recent D&D adventures, there are queer characters in the book. That is also true, and to a lesser extent, but still true in Dungeon of the Mad Mage. And it was true last year in our adventure, Tomb of Annihilation, that essentially we've made sure, starting with the Curse of Strahd, that every single one of our adventures, if you go around and meet all the NPCs, you're going to discover that just as in our world, queer people are all over the place. And that gets back to something I've often mentioned in these panels, is for us, it's really important in our storytelling to have a sense of authenticity, to make it feel like the D&D world is a living place that resonates and that feels like a real world. And our perspective is part of being a real world is having queer people in it.
Right.
That actually it is a lot of the fiction where queer people are erased is wildly unrealistic and, in my mind, nonsensical. And if you think of the amount of storytelling where there's no whiff of any queer person existing, that is not what the real world is like. All of us, whether we're queer or not, have queer people in our lives, and always have and always will.
Well, and it's the presumption, and you'll hear this a lot, that queer people and queer characters need to have somehow justify their presence in a story or in an adventure or in a context. You'll hear oftentimes the seemingly reasonable sounding position of, well, I don't mind queer characters as long as there's a clear reason in the plot for them to exist. And, to which I say, that's really interesting. What is your clear reason for existing? I'm pretty sure that things just exist. But it is that presumption that because queer people are not normal, that therefore they need some special permission in order to be there, to occupy space. And we were just talking prior to the panel. A lot of this is the process of erasing queer people from history, essentially. The notion that queer people have been pushed to the margins, and there's been a great deal of historical revision in terms of our very existence in cultures and histories all around the world. That has led to this notion of that, where did all these queer people come from? Like, they just sprang out of nowhere over these last 50 years.
Right.
And, it's even more so now with all of the many other varieties of queer people, more so now with transgender people and other people who are now just being able to come forward. For straight culture, it's like, where are all of these? Now there are all these new queer people. It's like, no, not new.
Right.
Always been here.
Right.
You just haven't seen them.
One of the things we were talking about before we came in, and it has specifically to do with erasing queer people, and also with the topic of this panel, gaming. There was the recent at E3 recent announcement of the Assassin's Creed game in ancient Greece. And apparently, to my pleasant surprise, the game will actually acknowledge that ancient Greece was filled with open homosexuality. But it is a sign, actually, of how much further we still need to go culturally, that there are people responding to this announcement saying, why are you doing this political thing of cramming gay people into ancient Greece? Like, think about that for a moment.
Right.
I mean, this is a culture where if you've been to any museum of ancient Greece and have looked at a few vases, or if you have gone,
it's like boys playing leapfrog.
Yes.
They're just not very good at it.
Yes. Oh, he landed in his lap again. Yeah. Or if you've seen sculpture from that time period, or read philosophy from that time period, or read poetry from that time period, you would know that in that culture, queer people weren't just accepted, they were lionized. If you've read Plato's Symposium, which is his meditation on love, a big part of the symposium is actually the characters arguing over whether, because a number of the characters think that same-sex love is naturally superior to opposite sex love because, and this is what's fascinating, the two people were equals.
Right.
Because of the misogyny in the culture at that time, it was never believed that a man and a woman could be equal. And so, and you can see sort of in their ancient minds thousands of years ago, them starting to glimmer, claw their way toward, wait, maybe there should be equality. But in the process, because they were also a deeply philosophical culture, the way they tried to resolve that for some of them, was we want there to be equality, but apparently there can't be between men and women. So then the conclusion some of them jumped to was, well, therefore, the most noble form of love is between two people of the same sex. Because, again, it was the two people, if it's true love and not a system of power, people need to be equal. And so what's interesting is what even a lot of modern folk don't know, and many queer people don't know, is even our modern notions of equality and our romanticization of love and how it's love between two equals, in many ways has in Western culture, its seeds in essentially meditations on same-sex love. And essentially that's where we started with this notion of people being equal. So then it becomes, for me, especially as someone who has spent a lot of my life delving into ancient history, particularly maddening when our history is erased. And anytime anything queer is talked about as modern or political, I'm like, really? 3,000-year-old stuff is political? It's, again, I feel sometimes it's like we all need to do a deep history lesson, not only for ourselves, but for the people around us, partly just to calm down and realize we've been here prominent for centuries, and we will be here prominent for centuries to come.
Indeed.
One last thing I'll say on this historical note before we veer toward Q&A is one thing a lot of people don't realize is there were even some people in the ancient world, in the West. So I'm specifically talking about Europe. And we could do a whole other panel and we could talk about queer presence in other cultures. As I said, these are things Steve and I have both done a tremendous amount of research in over the years. But there were people in the latter part of the Roman Empire who actually could see it happening. As Roman culture began to shake off the influence of Greek culture, and as Christianity stopped being really a sect that was about sort of freedom and social justice and began to be kind of absorbed by the empire and became the state religion. It was in that period that the tide began to turn against queer people. And there is a poem from that period where a queer writer actually talks about this process happening and says, "This was once our world, and we once walked around with kings, but now we are made aliens in our own land." And I often remember that because it's very easy for us sometimes in the modern world to think, we're great, look, we can get married. Or at least in some places. And for those of us not in countries where we're put in concentration camps, this has happened even within the last 2 years in Chechnya. But I often remember that not to scare myself or anyone else, but to remember we still have a lot of fighting to do, and we have to remain vigilant. Because, we often talk about, back then, they were super queer in the Greco-Roman period, but we often fail to pause and then think, wait, what happened? And what happened is the tide turned against them and they weren't ready. And were driven into closets for centuries. And there were a few flowerings. I mean, in the 15th century in Spain, there was actually, a lot of people don't know this, a flowering in Spain where even some of the Catholic bishops there started to murmur about acceptance of gay people. And this was in the Middle Ages. But then that too was then crushed by the Inquisition.
And also to sort of fold it back into world design and sort of our holistic view of things, it's the notion that we have so much more to do and that there's such a depth of historical context is when you start drawing on that thread of unraveling homophobia and dealing with queer civil rights, you find that there's just a vast tapestry attached to it. And saying, well, yes, if we can ensure our right to be married and we can ensure our right not to be fired or to be denied housing or to be denied the use of public services, then things will be fine. And it's like, and that in many ways is sort of like the fantasy world of if I just delete homophobia, that's inclusion. And really that's in many ways just the very basic surface things. That's the bare minimum that we as human beings should expect from our society is to be treated equally. The work that goes beyond that is dismantling an ages-old culture of misogyny and denigration of the feminine and gender roles and a huge amount of stuff that goes with that that involves digging really deep into a lot of things. I mean, we think that the queer civil rights movement, which has accomplished a tremendous amount in just 50 years, is in its infancy. It's just getting started with the amount of work that needs to get done as far as that goes. And there's a lot underlying that. And even in ourselves, things that we really need to look at and examine and say, where is this coming from? What are the roots of this? What does this really mean?
And we work on essentially entertainment, and sometimes I'll get asked, well, why is it important to include this stuff in entertainment? Well, part of it is we want to make our fellow queer people smile and feel like there's a place for them at the table. We want to expand the imaginations of non-queer people to see, hey, there are all these other types of characters that I can tell stories about, or in a role-playing game I can play. But also for me, there's this hope that our work in this entertainment, by making sure we're constantly as queer people present, we can help make sure that a tide like crashed over that writer in the Roman period never crashes over us again, to make sure we never let the culture forget us, that we are all around, we are powerful, we are influential. And so even in our goofy games, I think we could be making a difference.
Yeah, and especially in our tabletop games and in our role-playing games, while we are providing entertainment, we are also creating stories. And we're giving other people the tools and the context in which to create stories. And ultimately, stories are what define our reality. Stories are the foundation of our culture. They're the foundation of our understanding of ourselves. Our identities are just stories we tell ourselves about who we are. And so stories are an unbelievable power in our culture. And as it turns out, it's something that queer people are also really good at. I don't get too, high flown about the, notion of things I'm doing with, superheroes and wizards and elves and whatnot. I still like to think that being able to tell stories in which about a world where there is inclusiveness and there is justice and there is fairness can actually make those things into realities. Terry Pratchett has a great quote about that, about stories, about how we have to learn to believe all of the little lies, in order to believe the really big ones like justice and fairness, because those things are just stories we made up. They don't exist except for the fact that we make them exist.
So questions, comments, and these can be about things we work on, queer themes in gaming in general. It could also be about just being a queer person in gaming, whatever you like.
So, Jeremy, I think this is mostly a question for you. Who do I need to write a sternly worded letter to get singular they included in the D&D style book?
It already is.
Is it because I was sort of looking for it in Modern Games in the Coralon section, and it seemed like there was sort of a lot of writing around it.
Yes.
so that it didn't appear very prominently. And I bring this up because I'm a DM's Guild author. I recently wrote a section of an adventure that's going to drop next month, and it was important to me to have a non-binary NPC.
Yes.
And trying to do our best to kind of match the standard language of how adventures are written. We don't see a whole lot of examples of that, and it would be, just to say it would be awesome if that were a little bit more prominent in some of the things going forward.
Yeah, for those of you unfamiliar with D&D house style in terms of what people should or should not write in our books, like most publishing houses, our style guide has for many years been uncomfortable with singular they. I mean, because if you open up pretty much any style guide in a bookstore about writing, it will tell you don't do it. Partly because in writing it can actually lead to some confusion. Like if you're talking about multiple people, if the syntax is unclear, it can be unclear, which they are you referring to? Are you referring to this particular person? Are you referring to this group of people? But careful writer, careful editor can certainly make it work. And it was actually in the process of working on Morden Canaans that I had us change our style guide to adopt singular they. It's something you will see, I believe in Dragon Heist, there's at least one case of it where, because we have one of these blessed of Coralon who appears in the adventure, and I believe we do use the singular they in reference to that character. But that said, writers and editors are still going to often be inclined to write around it. So you'll often see the person's name said a lot. And again, which is not a bad thing in some contexts, especially if you're talking about that person with other people, and then it becomes important to know again which they do we mean. But again, I'm delighted to see not only its inclusion in our work, but I'm also noticing other publishing houses starting to alter their house style to include it. And also, by the way, it's something that we want not only for the characters who should have that pronoun. Honestly, it's also good for us so that when we're writing rules and in the third person, we're not having a bunch of torturous he or she's. And so, I mean, because most of us, the way we speak is we naturally use they actually in our regular speech all the time. And just most people aren't aware that they're doing it. Yeah, thank you for that question. Mm-hmm. Sir?
You've talked about some of the, I guess, NPCs that you've included in some of the D&D stories, and this is, again, for you, a little bit more generic. Do you see yourselves putting out anything that makes queerness more central to a story anytime soon? Or is that something that, because of the market of D&D, you kind of have to dance around? And I'm trying to see, how far do you see this going in terms of content?
So we have actually already made it prominent. But before I talk about the example, I want to say that one of the things we often face in our work, because our adventures in some ways are not stories so much as they are the ingredients for a story. Mm-hmm. So the story is actually what happens at your table. Yeah. And so what we're providing is a framework for the players and the DM to construct a story, and often the identity, the gender identity or the romantic or sexual relationships of the NPCs are rarely actually that important to most of our stories, mm-hmm. because often those tend to be matters when it comes to your gender identity, whom you love. Those tend to be issues that are explored more on the player side, which is why it was important in the player's handbook for us to say, hey, when you're making your character, consider these things, because that can result in some wonderfully rich storytelling at the game table driven by the players. Now, that all said, in the adventure Curse of Strahd, how many of you have played Curse of Strahd or read it? So for those of you who haven't played through it, or you did play through it and you didn't play through this particular part, in one of the rare cases of us where romance actually was an important part of an NPC storyline, in fact, in 5th edition, one of the only cases where romance has been important to a storyline, it was queer romance. Because in Ravenloft, or Curse of Strahd, there is this revenant, this undead knight you meet if you go to this fortress there, where there's this group of knights that came centuries before to fight the vampire lord Strahd, and these noble knights were defeated. And in their despair, they became undead and basically now have haunted this place ever since. Well, when you go there, and again, sorry for spoiling the adventure, but I want to answer your question. When you go there, you actually discover that one of these revenants remembers who he is. The others essentially have descended into their curse, and they don't remember their life of heroism and honor and glory from centuries before. They are really just creatures of vengeance now. But one of them remembers. He remembers who he is. And a fundamental part of who he is that he was the beloved of the knight's captain. And this knight captain who is leading them is essentially the one driving them in this life of vengeance. And so it turns out that, and this is actually one of the only glimmers of light in this entire Gothic horror adventure, is the way you can turn this revenant lord from his existence of darkness and vengeance is to bring his beloved before him and help him remember their love. And it is actually their love that reopens his heart and redeems him, yeah, and redeems this whole order of knights. And this group of knights can then become your allies to fight not only the vampire lord, but the other forces of darkness in the Lord's realm. So I would say that's kind of making queer love pretty central to a storyline. And because again, that is one of the only times where we've made the love between two NPCs in one of our 5th edition adventures an important part of the story. And again, that one time was the characters were queer.
Arden Lost Hope is great.
No, thank you. I'm glad you like it. It's interesting. The initial draft, to give you a little bit behind a view behind the curtain, the initial draft of Argenvostolt, the fortress of these knights, didn't have this story. In fact, it was just kind of this neat map with some monsters in it. And when I was evaluating the manuscript in its final few months, I was actually sorely tempted to cut it from the adventure because the book was too long. And I was like, oh my God, I've got to cut something. Or we've got to redeem this section to make it worth keeping it in the book. And so as I evaluated it, I said, well, what's really missing here is some kind of emotional hook, some kind of element where you really care about these characters. And also it was kind of falling flat because you had the good revenant and you had his captain, and the only reason given for why the good guy wanted to help you was just he liked his boss. And I just like, this is not going to grab people's hearts. And so it occurred to me, well, what if he's way more than his boss? He was his beloved. And then that just caused a full rewrite, and then it stayed in the book and then again turned into this thing, well, here's one of the only places in this place of darkness where you can find light.
So the takeaway being is the Revenant was uncut.
Yes. Oh, wow. Shame on you, Mr. Puns. All right here.
This is more from the, I guess, like the business side of it. When you're going out to, like push a product or push a story or anything like that into the market, like, what is the business side backlash that still exists? Because, I mean, you could obviously go on Twitter and go like, well, there it is in the culture. You could just say one thing, it explodes. But, like, on the business end, like, is it still kind of this thing where there's a lot of businesses are kind of pulling away from, or are they a lot more opening and accepting? Like, what is, I guess I don't know from the business end what it's like that way.
Well, I guess we can both answer from our different businesses.
Sure. I mean, my experience has been that there really is no business backlash that I have seen of any significance. There are mouthy, opinionated people on the internet, but that's not a business problem. If anything, it's a moderation problem. I was going to say a marketing problem. It's not even that. It's a, moderate your damn forums problem. I mean, if you have queer content in a product, some dude, because it's almost inevitably dude, is going to have a problem with it and is going to tell you so. But from our perspective, from the various companies I've worked with, from Green Ronin, from a lot of the companies I've freelanced for, it's not a business problem. Store owners, are interested in good products that people want to buy. Our experience as creators has been people want to buy good products that are inclusive and interesting and, present a whole world where they have a wider customer base. Hey, look, you can sell to more people, who are interested in buying your games. Store owners are pretty happy about that notion overall. In my experience, the people who are whining about the politics or are whining about the editorial content are just that. They're whining, and they weren't going to buy the book anyway. So,
or they are, and they're going to still
they're going to buy it and still whine about it. So it's like, go ahead, I have your money, I don't care.
Free press.
Right.
Yeah. We have found with D&D over the past 4 or 5 years that people have loved that we have worked to make sure people know this game is for everybody. And that goes not only for queer people, we've also made sure that we're constantly showing a good gender mix so that, we're showing lots of female heroes in addition to male heroes, along with androgynous heroes. We also strive for ethnic diversity, especially in our art. our fans have really embraced that. And as Steve said, you sometimes have that vocal minority, but they're not steering the ship, and we wouldn't let them. Also, D&D has just had two of its best years in history, business-wise. So a person could perhaps make an argument that all of this inclusivity is good for business. I mean, again, it's kind of a no shit kind of thing, right? That when you make more people feel like they're welcome, well, generally more people are going to show up. Whereas if you keep slamming the door in people's faces, that's a pretty sure way to drive people away.
Can you talk about the challenges of writing or NPCs and characters who are asexual and aromantic, and you've got an absence that is, how do you present that in a story way that comes forward when it's an absence of normal, or I don't want to say normal, it's an absence of expected behaviors?
Yeah.
How do you write for that kind of?
It's actually interesting you mentioned that, because we have Green Ronin's been doing more fiction recently based on our various settings, and I just read. I've been doing some sort of continuity checking and the like, and I just read an interesting Blue Rose story that, amongst other things, features an aromantic character. And there's a very nice and I thought very well done scene of simply a moment where someone makes a romantic advance towards the character in a very because they have a very close relationship, and she's like, no, sorry, like I appreciate that, I'm very flattered, but I just don't feel that way. And basically the very brief conversation is about me, no, not about anyone. And that's just how I feel. You're a treasured friend. I really enjoy your company, but I just don't feel that way towards anyone. And that was, and of course, because it's Blue Rose and that's the way people are, that was the end of the conversation, essentially, of like, oh, all right, then, so that's the way it is. I'm glad we're still friends, and that was it. And it was clear that was the that element of the character, but it wasn't dwelled upon anything further beyond that. And I thought it was a very nice character reveal that was very delicate, was smoothly handled, but then just kind of moved on, and it wasn't like this is the aromantic character from now on, because the character had a lot of other interesting facets to her.
Any other questions? Right here in front.
This one's more directed towards Steve. What sort of experiences have you had in trying to introduce non-monogamous dynamics into writing?
Well, some of it is finding the right context, and some of it is we were talking about with aromantic characters, you want it to be presented in a way that it comes up naturally, and it's not just a line item on somebody's character sheet, essentially. So it really does rely on context. We had a great opportunity in Blue Rose because we were creating another culture, essentially, to talk a lot about non-monogamous relationships, because we basically started from assuming that you knew nothing about how people in this culture constellated relationships. So we were able to say, well, some, people have, one partner and some people don't. And this is how they structure their relationships most typically. And that was a great opportunity in that particular setting. I've had fewer opportunities to deal with polyamory in a more modern future setting, but I'm strongly suspecting that Aberrant is going to change that, because we're getting to explore all kinds of things so far as that goes, and I know we're going to do a new version of the Queer Nova Alliance at some point. So we actually just had a very brief design discussion about, that fell back on the classic, because Aberrant is set 10 years in the future. It's a generally sort of positive and, progressive world. Would the Queer Nova Alliance really exist? Because, haven't we solved the problem? And I'm like, no. Let me stop you right there. It will most definitely still exist. And like Jeremy says, one of the other challenges is dealing with NPCs. They tend to be background characters, and their relationships tend to be kind of secondary. So it's hard to present that kind of a thing as anything other than a minor background element. And sometimes that's fine, and it's interesting to do, but other times it doesn't really do the subject justice, and you don't want it to feel like tokenism. So that's kind of the difficulty there.
In D&D, I actually had us very subtly within the past year or so deal with this. Because a lot of what we design, especially on the rules side, is really a toolkit for other people's storytelling. And I made sure that in Xanathar's Guide to Everything, when we included a ceremony spell, where this ceremony spell doesn't give you the ability to perform something like a marriage, but it gives you the ability to perform a marriage or a list of other ceremonies and imbue them with magic. Mm-hmm. And I made sure that in our wording of it, it says that the targets of the spell are adults who are willing to join into this union.
Or you might say consenting.
Yes, but I made sure that in the final version of the spell, it never specifies the number of those adults. Because and not only because I wanted to, give players the option to have these blessed triadic or relationships with even more people in them, but also because in D&D's history, some of the cultures in the worlds have polyamorous relationships. So, it's a great example actually of having to constantly be vigilant for things like this, because the draft that was given to me by the writer who was working for me did specifically say 2 people. Mm-hmm. And so I sort of had to wordsmith it to get the number of people out of the spell. But what's fascinating is most people will read the spell and not even notice it. Because their mind will fill in 2.
Right.
But the spell never says 2.
But the people who need to notice it will.
Yes, exactly.
Generally speaking.
And thankfully there have been people, on Twitter who were like, wait, did you really mean this to work this way? And like, yes. That was on purpose.
It does get a little awkward with the last sentence, which is about you can only benefit from that if you are widowed, because what does widowed mean in that terminology, which you have to kind of wrestle with.
And they're really, then we turn to the grace of our dungeon master.
Exactly.
Yes.
We actually have that situation come up.
Yeah. Because also for and really any tabletop role-playing game that has game masters, those of us who write the rule books and write the adventures and whatnot, we are always really just providing a service to the actual storytellers, and they are the ones who will often make the most interesting story choices using these elements.
Yeah.
I say that not only to talk about our work, but I say that also for all of you who are thinking about maybe becoming a role-playing writer. It's really important if you're writing for a role-playing game. This is versus like writing a novel or writing a play or writing a comic book or a screenplay. Yes. For a role-playing game, you don't have the same kind of narrative control that you have with those other narrative forms. So in some ways, you have to make your peace with that fact when you're writing for a role-playing game.
There was the joke on social media, I really wanted to write this detailed role-playing campaign where I am the sole player. I have been told that this is called writing a novel.
Right, yeah. But then the bright side of that is the amazing feeling when you have delivered this sort of set of ingredients to another storyteller and discover they have told stories with those ingredients that you never would have imagined.
Yeah.
And then the next group told a different story, and the next group told another story. So in a way, even though you don't get to have that single authorial voice and single vision, you instead actually get to be the person almost creating this big bang of stories, all radiating out just from, here's our adventure about this haunted tomb. And, and this, this thing suddenly spawned, thousands of stories, some of which probably deeply moved the people who were engaged in creating them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, indeed.
I have no idea what time it is.
It's about 4 o'clock.
Oh, okay. So we have 4 minutes.
I was just wondering, kind of we talked about some of the fantasy kind of elements, specifically more Western, earlier when we were speaking about it. I was wondering if you could kind of tap into some of your design processes and decisions when it comes to, like, I guess everyone kind of understands with, like, fantasy world, there's some foundations, right, that we all kind of take for granted, kind of the tavern and the village kind of thing. And with that, maybe this is just in my mind, but I kind of think of, kings and lineages of different orders of dynasties and things of that nature. How do you tap into some of the, tackling those tropes, but without kind of the realism of saying, well, back then, in the Middle Ages, they were really about, procreation and survival and things of that nature to survive your people. How do you kind of incorporate a queer narrative into those, with still keeping in mind, these people would still want to pass these on to those below them and such?
Okay. Well, there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, we could honestly, we have done entire panels just on this topic.
Yes.
Yes. So we will try to give you maybe each 2 minutes.
Yeah, that seems fair.
So one thing I would say right away is if you are, whether you're writing RPG material yourself or you're a game master, and so you're just doing this world creation for your own game, remember you're not writing about the Middle Ages.
Right.
You're writing about a world where people can be raised from the dead, transform into other animals, can
teleport from place to place.
Yes, can literally visit heaven or hell, can, if they're high enough level, have conversations with gods. So what I would say is, as a world creator, take those things seriously. Because if you're in a setting where all of this magic is possible, and you have beings like dragons and elves and whatnot that have been around for thousands of years, almost all of your cultural assumptions based on the Middle Ages are probably not taking your setting seriously enough. I also want to say, before I shut up so that Steve can answer, that also do some Middle Ages history reading, because what I find is a lot of assumptions that people have about the Middle Ages are false. Many people, for instance, assume that
there were no people of color.
Yeah, that Western Europe was all white people. So there was this thing called the Moorish Invasion, and it turns out also it is a very short trip, actually, from North Africa to the southern coast of Europe. There were many people of color, especially in the southern portions of Europe in that time. Also, this idea that women weren't in power. I would like to remind you that at one point, the most powerful person, it is thought by historians, on the entire planet was Queen Elizabeth of England. And also, again, queer people had a great prominence at various points.
Right.
So I'd say marry a deeper dive into real-world history and really embrace the magic of your setting.
Yeah. I mean, briefly. First of all, queer people can procreate. Let's not, work on that assumption. There are plenty of instances. And especially in a fantasy world, who knows what the other options are as far as that goes in terms of lineage and the like.
One quick interruption, just on this point. My sister is a lesbian and has 2 daughters, and they are her biological daughters, thanks to science. So if science can pull this off, magic certainly can.
Right. A lot of it is applying certain, in some ways, modern or more advanced sensibilities to a setting that are not, the Middle Ages. To a certain degree, starting from where you want to end up and working your way back and setting things up so it comes out that way. So for example, to use Aldea, Blue Rose's setting, we know that Aldea has people who have healing magic, and we know that amongst other things, they also have a great deal of herb lore and what is essentially alchemy. So we made it very clear that there is extremely safe and effective birth control in Aldea that's widely available to men and women, and that is simple and common, and anyone who wants it uses it. So there aren't unwanted pregnancies, generally speaking. To use a larger example, in Aldous, the Kingdom of the Blue Rose, we do have Aldous is ruled by a sovereign, but the sovereign is chosen by a supernatural being who is called the Golden Heart, who is essentially the patron spirit of Aldous as a nation. And the Golden Heart chooses the next sovereign after the previous sovereign passes. And it's not a blood lineage that is descended from a single family or a dynasty. It's whomever the heart chooses. And interestingly enough, sometimes the heart makes some interesting choices. And it's like, oh, okay, well, I guess, divine right has said you're the sovereign now. And generally speaking, the Golden Heart, chooses well for reasons of its own. And some surprising sovereigns have turned out to be quite effective. But it does create challenges in dealing with people's expectations. And similarly, in fact, nobility in all this is also not hereditary. It's actually an office you hold, and you have to go through a series of tests and the like to achieve it. But it has been occasionally difficult to drive into writers' heads that, the nobility in this kingdom is not hereditary. Please stop talking about noble families. There is no such thing. That kind of a thing. So there are definitely expectations to overcome, but with a little bit of thought, you can definitely set up whatever it is you want and figure out a reason why it exists.
Thank you, everyone, so much for coming. It was fun talking with you.
So, Tabletop Gamers is the group that's responsible for the Gamer and Ally Ribbons. We do a bunch of programs. We were working with the Queers, the Three-Sided Die panelists to put these panels on. If you would like to have more of these kind of panels and events, please let us know. Assuming you've got your ribbon, our website is on here, tabletopgamers.org. There's a contact us. You can provide us with feedback if there's things you'd like us to talk about. If there are conventions you'd like us to see at and do more Queers of Three-Sided Die panels, please mention that as well. We also have a newsletter that we try not to spam you too much, maybe once a month or so, that lets you know what we're doing, where we're going to be at, and what's going on. I just want to thank Jeremy and Steve for their time today, and I wish a happy birthday to Steve.
Thank you. And thank you, Jeff, for all the organization that Tabletop Gamers puts into this, because God's no Jeremy, I don't have the time to do it.
Yes. And again, if you haven't grabbed wristbands and buttons and stuff, we've got them on the back table.